Welcome to the System-Based Advocates and Community-Based Advocates, the role they each play Quicktool. My name is Jennifer Storm, and I have worked with crime victims for more than 20 years. Victim advocates are trained professionals that offer vital information and support to help those impacted by crime access rights, services, and systems. Victims advocates are often referred to as the navigators of the systems and services for victims after a crime has occurred. Consider them like a compass, guiding you through an otherwise overwhelming and confusing process. Just like in many professions, however, not all with the title of victim advocate play the same role. This Quicktool will provide an overview of some of the differences between the various victim advocates. Victim advocates go by many titles, sometimes victim assistance coordinators, sometimes victim assistance personnel. Often people think of victim advocates as being employed by prosecutors' offices, rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, police departments. But did you know that there are victim advocates that work in the following places? College campuses, probation and parole departments, prisons and jails, faith-based community organizations, child protective services, legal service agencies, immigration organizations, and many more. Depending upon who employs a victim advocate and the scope of their job, they generally fall into two categories. Those connected directly to the criminal justice system are labeled system-based, and those who work in the community are labeled community-based. There are distinctions between system-based advocates and community-based advocates that are important to know and understand. A system-based advocate typically has ready access to critical information about where a case in the system is, such as hearing dates, assigned to law enforcement or prosecutors, release dates, and more. They often have a direct line of communication to the prosecutor, police officer, or official who is making decisions on your case. Because they are tied to the system, their availability may be limited to the hours of that system or within the limited scope of any activity around that specific case. They often have limited hours, such as business hours of the courts or the agency where they work. They rarely have legal confidentiality with a victim. This means that information shared with them may need to be shared with law enforcement or the prosecutor and ultimately the defendant. Let's hear from Angela Parker Quarles, a survivor discussing her experience with her system-based and community-based advocate.
So early on in the process, the system-based advocates seemed to be just that, system-based, sort of, behind the scenes kind of thing. System-based, it was 8 to 5, right? So if there was anything that was needed before 8 o'clock or after 5 o'clock, it almost felt like I had to pause it until the next day. In the long run, the system-based advocates are there to keep us notified as to what's going on with the offender, keep us notified if there's any appeals, if they escape, if there's a change in custody, and they also help us with forums. I just recently participated in a survivor forum, which was very informative. And I think the biggest informative piece of it is it kind of tells you what direction maybe the system is going in, and it affords survivors an opportunity to have a voice in those decisions as to what direction they're going in.
Community-based advocates do not always have ready access to information about case status. They often work shifts that allow them to offer support after normal business hours, such as hotlines and on-call services. They usually have confidentiality and often have privilege over their communications with victims, meaning any information shared with them can remain in confidence unless it rises to a legally mandated reporting circumstance. The primary focus is not necessarily the criminal justice system. Let's again hear from Angela discussing her experience with her community-based advocate.
Community-based, I felt like there was always someone available, not just Monday through Friday, but also on the weekends. So if something was needed, we had a number to call and we would talk to a live person to have that support. So I think that the folks that are in the community have been there, done that almost. They go from their heart, they maybe even go from some experiences, and they allowed me to drive the conversation. It wasn't driven by a list of questions that they had to ask or certain information that they needed to get.
Whether an advocate is system-based or community-based, their job is to provide support to victims and to be ready with referrals to other services such as therapy, support groups, and options for victims. Because advocates come in so many different forms and are involved in a variety of agencies and organizations, it is not uncommon for a crime victim to have multiple advocates or coordinators. This is ideal in some circumstances and why it is so important to understand their respective roles and differences.
One myth that I would like for a crime survivor to know about our role within the criminal justice system is that we can be on their side and we can be helpful, although we're working within the system. We're system-based, but our goal is also to look for justice for them and for our communities. We can't stay in our silos. We have to reach out and we have to understand what else someone can bring that will be helpful to the crime victims and survivors that we work with every day.
Particularly because I am in a community-based advocacy program, my work had to partner with systems, with folks in the criminal justice system. And I think eventually I realized that maybe if that wasn't clicking, that was okay. And that it was okay to just focus on providing advocacy and support for victims. And people impacted by crime kept finding their way to our program. And a lot of times they didn't even have cases in the system. And so I started to understand there's lots of different ways to do this work, and that even just being purely in the community is okay, and that it's a really actually huge world of need.
Both types of advocates work to ensure that victims' rights are not violated, that victims feel heard, feel protected, and feel safe, and have a meaningful opportunity to insert their rights in the criminal justice system to an extent in which they feel most comfortable with. Warm handoffs between system-based advocates and community-based advocates are always encouraged. As we all know, the criminal justice system can be extremely re-traumatizing for victims, so it is important to remain trauma-informed at all times. By doing warm handoffs when collaboration is warranted between new advocates, it not only alleviates any stress, anxiety, or discomfort a victim may feel, but is also an opportunity for advocates to be on the same page .
So when I meet with a victim or survivor for the first time, I let them know that I am the victim services coordinator and an advocate for our police department, but I am not a police officer. My role is to be there for them, to answer any questions that they have about the criminal justice system, to offer emotional support, to safety plan, to help connect them to any resources that they might want or need. I also let them know that I am not a confidential advocate, but I can get them connected to a confidential advocate if that's something that they would like. I let them know my availability, that I am not a 24/7 crisis hotline myself, but I also make sure that they have contact information for 24/7 support. I let them know that I'm a mandatory reporter, and if they feel like hurting themselves, someone else, or situations where child abuse, elder abuse, or vulnerable person abuse might be occurring, that is something that I have to report. And I also let them know that anything that they share with me about the facts of a case might be something that I have to share with a police officer or someone within the system.
So I think the key similarity is that we are here to support victims and survivors, and we do so by understanding our positionalities, as in how we are perceived in our respective by survivors, and based on the restrictions we have in terms of confidentiality or the boundaries of our roles. So ultimately, this opens all sorts of collaborative possibilities to meet the same goals, but with different tools available to us. So this means that as a community-based advocate, oftentimes I explore how I can help victims access resources or support systems or even systems with a level of privilege of greater comfort and trust with survivors.
So one difference between system-based advocates and community-based advocates is that system-based advocates are typically hired by the state or the government. Because of their employment, system-based advocates can have certain restrictions or limitations on the type of services that they're able to provide crime victims. Most often, their interests must align with the state or the government, whereas community-based advocates do not have the same limitations or restrictions because they are not affiliated with the state or the government. So their interests can align more so with the victim instead of the state or the government. Community-based advocates are able to provide direct service to crime victims both before and after the crime has been reported to law enforcement. In situations where a victim does not feel comfortable disclosing to law enforcement, community-based advocates are able to assist them in their cases as well.
I would describe my role as, I'm not a traditional victim advocate, I would say necessarily. I work in a refugee resettlement office. And so I'm the director of the resettlement program here in the state of Alaska. So we oversee all services for refugees in their first 5 years. I should say more than just refugees, asylees, foreign-born victims of human trafficking, and a couple other categories of individuals that are covered under the Office of Refugee Resettlement. If you're a navigator outside of the traditional setting, so you're not working in a police office, you're not a lawyer, you're not a victim's advocate, you are an outsider too. And I think that's something that we have to remember, is that this is also not my area of expertise, but my office has an area of expertise, and that's refugees, and it's the people that we serve, and we understand some of the challenges and the traumas that come with being that population. And so, the first thing that really has to happen when you're a non-traditional person interacting in this world is you have to build connection and rapport with those entities outside of when you need them. I think it's important when we work with providers and we work with non-traditional partners or even anything that both sides come to the table and very early on say, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do. And that's really important. One, because we want the client to know what I can do and what I can't do. And I want the provider to know what I can do and what I can't do. And when we don't have that conversation early on, there's a lot of confusion between both sides. And the person who usually suffers is the client in the middle, who's the victim, who needs the services.
The specific things that I can help facilitate as a campus advocate would be to coordinate what we call academic remedies. So that might be having a conversation with a student's professor about maybe flexible deadlines or helping them to understand the effects of trauma. Not all campus advocates have the same policy around confidentiality. Oregon is where I work, and we are unique in a way that our campus advocates are allowed legal privilege. And there are some kind of stipulations to how that privilege can be applied, or I guess what pieces need to be in place for a campus advocate to have that level of privilege and confidentiality. But I know too that institutions are allowed to, by policy, make any staff person deemed confidential as well. So there are different models available for how that can be enacted in an institutional university. The campus advocate, we're maybe sometimes straddling the roles of a system-based advocate and a community-based advocate, and more in a way where we have our own unique community, our campus community, and we have our own administrative system that we're working within. But we also engage outwardly, right, beyond campus, beyond our institution. So we are not necessarily the experts in those areas, but we are skilled at kind of making those connections on behalf of our students and building the relationship with our system-based and our community-based advocates so we can work together in collaboration and potentially do the handoffs as needed, depending on where the student might need to go.
We hope hearing from these amazing advocates in the field of victim services has given you a better understanding of the role of an advocate and the differences between a system-based and a community-based advocate. To learn more about victim services and where you can access help in your area, please visit our webpage at ncvli.org.